Check one, two. Good afternoon. Good morning. Sorry, late morning. Thank you all for being here at this informational forum of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. My co-chairs will be here any moment. But I guess I just wanted to kick off by saying that this is we always have lots of conversations about the fiscal guardrails, but this year in particular, we've had quite a few of them. Of course, the governor has made a proposal in his budget with respect to them. And our goal for this forum today is really to be descriptive more than normative. In other words, we want to make sure that everybody who's part of this policy conversation understands exactly what the guardrails are, what they have done for us historically, and maybe also what they've kept us from doing, so that we have a good background of data from which to make recommendations. So, the ranking members, any welcoming comments? Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the chairs, the OFA, Treasurer Russell, and Pew, all for making this meeting happen. I think this is a very important discussion for us to have at the onset of the budget discussions. The most important discussion we'll have in this building over the next 2 years on perhaps the most important policy innovation the state of Connecticut has seen in the last 15 years. So I welcome the discussion and appreciate everyone who is participating and making it happen.
Thank you, Senator Fazio. Representative Paletta? No? Okay. So I will kick us off by extending again my deep gratitude for all the work that the Office of Fiscal Analysis does for all of the legislature, but particularly for this committee. I feel very fortunate to work in a state that has invested in nonpartisan analysis. I cannot imagine working in a space where we had to have partisan arguments over numbers. And I know that OFA in particular works very hard to do that work and to remain, to keep things nonpartisan and strictly fact-based. So, which is why we're kicking the hearing off with you, frankly. So, Office of Fiscal Analysis, I welcome you. Thanks for being here.
It's our pleasure, and thank you very much for the kind words. It's really appreciated. I'm Neil Ayers with the Office of Fiscal Analysis. I'm joined up here today with our CAP experts, Chris Wetzel to my right, Bill Letterman, and Michael Murphy. We also have a wide array of our analysts, subject matter analysts here. On the off chance you stump this esteemed panel with a question or two, we have backup. Okay, as you all know, and some of you probably remember, the fiscal guardrails were adopted after the long and painful summer and fall of 2017. They were modified, somewhat modified the year after that. Today, we're going to try to look at a very high level look at the guardrails, specifically with a focus on how they'll impact your budget process coming up. We're going to try not to get into the weeds and mire us down in the legal minutia of them. Try to keep it more, we're fiscal, we're not legal, so we're going to try to keep it to the fiscal aspect of it. To that end, you hear fiscal guardrails is kind of like this big monolith. We have guardrails. The reality is they're a series of distinct fiscal controls that both interact and reinforce each other. As we want to highlight the impact on the upcoming budget cycle, we are going to focus on, in blue up here, the revenue cap, the volatility cap, the budget reserve fund, and the spending cap, although I always say more appropriately called the appropriation cap. It doesn't cap spending per se, it caps appropriations. What we're not going to be looking directly at this today are the bond cap and bond lock aspects of it. They're less likely to come in play in the upcoming budget cycle. That being said, should questions go into the minutia, we're here ready to answer any of that. And happy to do so. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Bill, who's going to walk you through a number of slides, basically looking at the impact and interaction of various caps.
Thanks, Neil. So to start, we're going to be talking about the revenue cap and the volatility cap. To start, we're going to combine these two together because they have the same basic impact, which is that they make revenue unavailable to be appropriated. We're also going to be talking about the budget reserve fund and the BRF cap. As Neil mentioned, we're going to take a big picture approach to everything to start before we get into some of the details and even the dollar amounts. And the first step to that is talking about the budget. And like I said, the caps make revenue unavailable to be appropriated. That capped revenue then feeds into our budget reserves and help provide an overall level of protection against budget volatility or recession. It's important to note that the caps and the BRF work together to create a combined protection against any changes within a budget. In the case of volatility within a year, those funds can be sent back towards the budget to stabilize it and help prevent any issues within the budget after it has passed. So in the event that everything goes to plan, or as budgeted, then the funds will be deposited into the budget reserve fund. Due to years of things going as planned, the budget reserve fund is currently full and at its cap. So in that case, money is then used to reduce our liabilities. Those reductions to our unfunded liabilities and our pensions then create future savings that feed back into our budget. So just to step back, the big picture is the money essentially is either it's going to be used now in the current budget or in future budgets, whether during a time of crisis or through long-term savings in our payments towards our pensions. Now that we have the big picture, we were going to bring in some of the numbers using FY26 as our baseline. So all of these numbers are based on January consensus revenue estimates for the general fund. The big number for this year's budget is 1.6 billion, which is the combined impact of the revenue and volatility caps. So 1.6 is dedicated towards the cap and can't be budgeted. The current balance for the budget reserve fund is 4.2 billion. We project that there's going to be continued savings because we're at the cap. So far, based on previous contributions towards our unfunded liabilities, we have estimated 727 million in savings from our pension plans. So that impacts FY26 already. That 1.6 billion in this year's budget, if we actually achieve that and it's saved at the end of the year and goes towards our unfunded liabilities, those savings won't be realized until FY28. So that brings us back to the 1.6 billion and what that is composed of. So it is a combination of the volatility and revenue cap with 1.3 billion being attributed to the revenue cap. Chris is going to talk more about the volatility cap and the volatility cap threshold.
Thank you for that completely unrehearsed segue, Bill. The volatility cap, what is it? It applies to the estimated and final payments portion of the personal income tax, as well as the pass-through entity tax. Essentially, the volatility cap transfers revenue from these sources that are above the cap's threshold into the budget reserve fund. So again, bringing it back to the numbers, in FY26, the volatility cap threshold is 4.1 billion. This is compared to the current cumulative projections for estimates and finals and PET of 5.4 billion for FY26. So the difference, which you see there, is the 1.3 billion, and that's what would be dedicated to the volatility cap during the year and transferred to the budget reserve fund after the fiscal year closes if we've done our jobs correctly. Each of the consensus revenue reports and the finance revenue and bonding revenue schedule in the support of the budget include a line item titled Transfers to the Budget Reserve Fund Volatility Adjustment, which makes it easy for you all to see the current and projected volatility transfer amounts. It also means that when we're calculating budgetary balances, this amount is already excluded. Bill, would you like to provide more detail on the revenue cap?
Sure. So the revenue cap is projected at being 300 million for FY 26. The mechanics of this works a little differently than the volatility cap. Instead of capping just E&F and PET, it's a limit on all revenue. And effectively what it does is it requires a budgeted surplus of 1.25%. Technically, the way it works is it limits the amount of revenue that can be appropriated to 98.75%. There's also a similar cap on the transportation fund, which is worth about 30 million itself. Due to the size of the volatility cap, the 1.3 billion, we thought it'd be worth going into some of the history of when it was first created and what has happened since it has been created. So we have to go back to 2015 when the FY 16 and 17 biennial budget was created. At that time, there was an assumption that E&F and was going to continue to grow. Income tax was going to continue to grow into 16 and 17, and then the budget was built off of those assumptions. As we entered FY 16, it turned out the revenue was not coming in. The major culprit for income tax being off was identified as estimated final payments. And they ended up being down at the end of the year, 158 million from FY 15. While that's a pretty big decrease, the bigger problem was that the budget ended up being off 652 million in just the income tax. So that led to a lot of budgetary strain within that fiscal year, which started laying the groundwork for wanting to do the volatility cap. FY 17, E&F went down an additional 266 million. So what that meant is based on the original biennial budget, the income tax was down 1.4 billion in total. And it was at this time, this is when the volatility cap was thought up, designed, and implemented for FY 18. At that time, we were still estimating income tax as one thing. We decided to break it out. We now estimate and budget E&F separately. And then, at that time, it was pretty rough times. We didn't have a lot of money at this time. So next, we just want to see what happens next. As you can maybe tell, we had a lot of money after FY 18. The actual revenue came in significantly above our capped amounts. On average, it was revenue came in $1 billion over the cap amounts, and that is excluding FY 18 and FY 22, which were outliers for various reasons. So there's been a significant amount of money that came in over the cap during this time. The cap itself, it started as 3.1 billion and has grown to 4.1 billion as of 2026. The growth is based on statute. It's the 5-year compound annual growth in personal income is the basis of how that grows. Moving on. The numbers Chris talked about in terms of the volatility cap, the 4.1 and the 1.3, you can see on this graph over on the right under 2026. So that explains the 1.6. So now we're going to move on to the budget reserve fund and the 4.2 billion. The budget reserve fund, we're essentially projecting that in 26, it'll be at the cap amount. The budget reserve fund is actually capped at 18% of general fund appropriations in the current fiscal year. What this means in practice is presuming you pass an FY 26 budget, the cap will then be based off of that for the close of FY 25. So the actual amount is going to depend on what budget is passed for FY 26. But currently we project it at 4.2. The budget reserve fund is limited in terms of how it can be used. And allowable uses are included here on the slide. As we talked about before, our recent history is significant deposits into the budget reserve fund above the cap of 18%. And those are required to go to reduce the CSRS and TERS on unfunded liability. which has helped bring us savings. And now we're going to go a little more into that. Like I said, it's been 8.6 billion has been deposited into the SERS and TERS between FY20 and FY24. On the right, you can see the history of the annual savings as they've grown as we've contributed more and more towards those unfunded liabilities. It should be noted that the actual calculations are very complicated. As money is dedicated towards SERS and TERS, we require actuaries to recalculate what we owe, and it's a moving target. So the deposits are not the only variable that they are considering when they do a reevaluation. So the changes in the ADAC will change year to year for other reasons besides just these deposits. So that brings us back to our fiscal guardrails left to be talked about. So now Chris is going to talk about the spending cap.
Thank you once again, Bill. You read my mind. We want to talk a little bit about the spending cap. It is the OG, the original guardrail. As Neil mentioned, it applies to appropriated amounts within the 13 appropriated funds. Essentially, the mechanics of it, it breaks up the budget into two tranches, capped appropriations and uncapped. Capped items are subject to a growth rate that's based on the greater of the 5-year compound annual growth in personal income, or the 12-month change in core inflation, which core inflation is all items less food and energy. The actual growth rate for this upcoming biennium, which you'll all will be dealing with for FY26, is 5.11%. That is based on the personal income growth factor. The chart there we put up just to show you that this is actually relatively high, given recent historical standards. It equates to about $1 billion in allowable cap growth for FY26. There are some items, as I mentioned, that are uncapped. That's debt service, federal funds, and transfers from the budget reserve fund. I should also mention that the unfunded accrued liability for the teachers' retirement system is uncapped through FY26, but it becomes capped beginning in FY27, both years that are part of the upcoming biennium. So that is something we're going to be dealing with as part of this budget cycle. Separate from that, there's also exemptions for the first year only of spending on federal mandates and court orders, as well as a state match to certain federal programs, those that the state begins participating on after October 31st, 2017. There is a statutory requirement that requires a base adjustment. We call base adjustment that has to be made when appropriated funds are moved to or from non-appropriated funds, which is what we think of as when we say off budget. So when we're moving money on or off budget, base adjustments are made. Revenue intercepts, so one side of the budget to the other, as well as bonding, if we move appropriations to or from bonding. Base adjustments essentially ensure that the calculations are made on an apples to apples basis, although they can affect the amount of allowable growth given in any given year. Finally, the spending cap can be legally exceeded via an emergency declaration by the governor and a 3/5 vote of each chamber. I had in my notes to drop the mic, but that does not appear possible here. So I think we're going to close it out. And
with that, like I said, we try to take a high level and apply it as best to you as policymakers in your upcoming decision making. So would be happy to answer or try to answer anything, questions you may have for us.
I appreciate both the information and the comedy routine. So make sure that we're all staying awake here.
That's why we keep Chris around.
We all have our roles. So I will start off with a small question, which is just because there have been a bunch of conversation of proposed bills about the different growth rates used for spending cap, for the volatility threshold. Could you explain sort of the rationale for the different growth rates and how they work, how that affects?
I don't think we can necessarily explain the rationale. Those were policy decisions that were adopted by the legislature. Do you have anything about the specific rates themselves?
I mean, we can get into sort of, they have been changed over the years, at least as far as the spending cap goes. Spending cap was originally calculated on a fiscal year basis. It originally was based on regular inflation, not core inflation. Those changes were the changes that changed it to the 12-month calendar year inflation and 5-year calendar year personal income compound annual growth were actually a result of the spending cap commission, which was all summer of, I think, 2016, 2017. And so those recommendations actually came out of that spending cap commission as far as the spending cap goes. For the volatility cap, it's always been the 5-year compound annual growth rate in personal income. And to be honest with you, I think that sort of was part and parcel with the discussion that was happening at the time with the spending cap commission. I think the thinking was that since the income tax is related to personal income and we use the 5-year compound annual growth rate for the spending cap, that it might make sense to do that as well for the volatility cap.
Thank you. Representative Paletta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Thank you for the very insightful presentation. Very briefly, I wanted to talk about the $727 million in freed up monies that, as a result of these caps, we have been able to use in our operating expenses. And I just, if you could just shed some light, one of you, because we've heard a lot in the last, several years that we've been constrained, but when I first got here, we were really constrained because we didn't have any money, and every proposal dealt with a tax increase rather than a tax decrease. So these caps have obviously worked. They've been beneficial to the average person, to the taxpayer in Connecticut, but also to the legislature that crafts biennium budgets every 2 years. And we look for ways to, save, but we also sometimes need to look for revenue. This has provided us with additional revenue. Could one of you explain that 727 million and where it's used and how it's been beneficial, and just reaffirm that that money, it has been freed up as a result of us paying down debt?
It's, I think you said additional revenue. It's not additional revenue. It's what the actuaries tell us on a year-to-year basis that Connecticut has for a while, finally, has funded at 100% of the actuarially determined employer contribution for the state employees' retirement and the teachers' retirement. What that 700 essentially represents is we have to, that 100% is $727 million lower than it would have been had we not made these additional deposits. So we would have had to, in coming up with a balanced budget and under the caps and everything, found that additional 700 some odd room. It wasn't specifically spent on any other one thing. It just allowed, basically helps the budget balance.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, thank you, Neil, it freed up $727 million in the budget.
Yes.
Okay.
And as Bill said, there's other things that go into the actuary's determination, how well the fund's investment, a bunch of different things, but that is one of the major factors in determining it every year.
And that's a significant amount of money. And we're talking, potentially about a $28 billion a year budget. So $727 million getting freed up as a result of good policy, in my opinion, is a plus. And thank you for shedding some light on that. And I think when looking forward over the next couple of months, we need to take that into consideration, and the amount of money that we have freed up in our budget as a result of these fiscal guardrails. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And I just remembered that we had made an arrangement to take questions at the end of all 3 presentations. So given that no one has yet made meaningful eye contact with me, I'm going to revert to that original agreement that we had. And thank you for being here, and move on to our, that's okay. It's not your fault. If you could, of course, stay in the room, that would be helpful, along with the rest of your colleagues who fill up that flank of the room on a regular basis. So we will welcome the treasurer. Good morning, Mr. Treasurer. It is still barely morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I was going to be pulling up a presentation really quickly.
give some preview of coming attractions, which is in the.
Yeah, sure.
In the gray area of the
Yeah.
OFA presentation, there was a reference to the bond lock,
Yes.
which
so
I
that's-
believe the treasurer is.
That
going
is
to
the
give
main
us-
piece that we will
give
be
us,
covering.
A little bit more detail.
That we'll be covering today. And first, just want to say thank you. Thank you to OFA for the really comprehensive presentation on several of the features of the guardrails. We will be focusing on the bond covenant piece, which is commonly referred to as the bond lock. So we have the presentation here. Or we did for a second.
Everyone got that, right?
Yeah. I guess I'll start with some of the basics and we can jump into the presentation. But generally, when we think about the bond covenant, just for understanding of what that is, it is an agreement between issuers and bondholders. So folks that are out purchasing bonds on the market. In this case, specifically, the state is the issuer, obviously. And so it's a legally binding agreement that restricts actions of the issuer. And again, in this case, it's the state that we're talking about. But the intent is really to protect the interests of both parties and to ensure that the issuer can make the necessary debt service payments on bonds that are outstanding. So some examples of bond covenants that are very common are financial reporting requirements, continuing disclosure requirements, agreements around principal and interest that are being paid in the timeline for those repayments, and maintaining specific funded ratios for that debt service. Could jump to the next slide. So as was outlined, the bond covenants related to the state's budget controls are a promise to bondholders that the state will comply with and not make changes to certain statutes. And these are obviously colloquially referred to as the fiscal guardrails. These are the statutes that are referenced in this slide and that were just covered by OFA, but they refer to bond caps, which are both the amount of bonds that are issued as well as the amount of bonds that are authorized by the state. It is the spending cap, the revenue cap, and the volatility cap. The covenants not only require the state to comply with these statutory frameworks, but they prohibit any public or special act from amending these statutes during certain periods of time. Any public act that, for example, adjusted what was included under the spending cap or that altered the limit or on issuing debt would be in violation of the bond covenants themselves. Now, you may be asking yourselves, how are we able to change the volatility cap and not be in violation of the bond covenant, as was proposed in the governor's budget? The statutes themselves include mechanisms for altering some of the budget controls, including the threshold for the volatility cap. So some of these changes require the governor to declare a state of emergency or an extraordinary circumstance, while others, like the volatility cap, merely require the General Assembly to pass a new threshold with a 3/5 vote in response to changes in state or federal tax law or policy or significant adjustments to economic growth on tax collections. So, while a change to the volatility cap threshold may be amending this statute, it's within the parameters. It's actually built into the guardrails themselves. It would not be in violation of those bond covenants. This is just a basic timeline for the guardrails and the covenants themselves. So the statute requiring the covenants were enacted in 2017 in the 2017 budget, and the covenants were included in bonds issued from May 15th of 2018 through July 1st of 2020. The covenants themselves then expired on July 1st of 2023. And as you all know, were renewed by the legislature in January of 2023. And so they currently expire on July 1st of 2033, unless the legislature adopts a resolution to change or amend those guardrails by July 1st of 2028. And the statute specifically requires the adoption of a resolution between January 1st and July 1st of 2028. Otherwise, those guardrails would continue on for another 5 years. So just thinking about the impact of the bond covenants themselves, the value of the covenants is not just present in the statutory changes around budget controls. They really sent a signal to the market around the state's commitment to prioritizing fiscal health. So part of my job as treasurer is communicating with investors and rating agencies. And they have seen that Connecticut has been committed to this work, not just because of the work that has been done up to this point. So in terms of paying down debt, filling our rainy day fund, it is often referenced that the bond covenant is the state's commitment on a going forward basis, which is something that investors and rating agencies are factoring in when they are making determinations around our bond ratings as a state, as well as investors are making when looking at purchasing our bonds. For them, it's assurance moving forward, and that is priced into what investors are willing to pay for our bonds and rating agencies in coming up with the ratings that they've assigned us recently. So I say that just so we're not only thinking about the work that has been done and the progress that's been made under these covenants, it's about the commitment looking forward with the covenants as well. The next slide, have often been asked about kind of consequences of violating these bond covenants or these agreements. And there's several pieces. One, there's litigation risk. Bondholders, again, as they have purchased our bonds, and we've entered into these covenants with them, they have the ability to sue in the event that we are violating terms of these contracts. And part of, it's hard to calculate exactly what the direct damages would be, but I think that if you're thinking about it from a bondholder perspective, they paid a price for these bonds with the understanding that they have a certain amount of security that's built into these covenants. There's question on whether or not these bonds that were issued would be less valuable in the event that some of these covenants were violated. There's reputational harm with the investment community, and in a simple way thinking about it is the state not keeping its word, right, to the market and not knowing what the result of that would necessarily be. And then, the reputational harm, I think, related to potential downgrades in our ratings. As I mentioned, much of the work that has been done and as well as these covenants have been built into the ratings that we've been assigned. And there is potential that we could have negative rating impacts if we were to violate one of our existing bond covenants. And the direct cost to that would be that cost of borrowing and issuing new debt and building out new projects could increase if our ratings were to be downgraded. Just on the next slide, here's just an example, and obviously very hard to see, but this is actually from an actual bond that we issued. And just so it gives you some kind of direct understanding, these are the actual fiscal guardrail statutes that are put directly into the bond with bondholders. So these are the, word for word agreements tying the actual fiscal guardrail statutes to the agreements with bondholders. And keeping this brief and keeping it on message and specific to the bond covenants, I know we're going to go through the rest of presentations, but happy to answer any questions after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, and thank you for sticking around for questions at the end. With that, we will welcome Pew Charitable Trust. That was quicker than last time, so we're improving ourselves.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation today. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Josh Goodman. I'm a senior officer with the Pew Charitable Trust. This is my colleague, Mark Robin. And Pew has worked on state fiscal issues for almost 2 decades now. Our primary focus is how states can ensure their budgets are sustainable over the long term. We've worked with Connecticut off and on for at least a decade now. So it's great to be back in Connecticut. We're going to talk about four topics today. First, how the guardrails compare to policies around the country. Each of these policies is interrelated, but serves a somewhat different purpose, and there's similar policies that other states have adopted. Second, what are some of the results of the guardrails so far? And then, especially in data that we at Pew track. Then I think one of the big questions is, has Connecticut saved enough? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to conduct analysis to answer that question, seeing that the BRF balance has increased substantially since the guardrails were enacted. And then Mark's going to do some analysis of the volatility cap formula, looking specifically at different levers the state could pull if it chose to adjust that formula. So first, how do the guardrails compare? So each of these, we're really going to talk about the first four policies: the spending cap, the revenue cap, the volatility cap, and the bond caps. And one thing that's notable is Connecticut, I didn't realize until a few days ago when I was preparing this presentation, is the only state in the country that has every single one of these policies. And I think that isn't necessarily bad or good, or it more shows that sort of the complexity of the top task before you as you consider these different policies, thinking about, how they fit together, and if any changes are necessary. I thought the treasurer covered the bond lock very well. That hasn't been a primary focus of our research to date. So first, the spending cap is an example of what's known as a tax and expenditure limit. And 26 states have tax and expenditure limits. These are policies that hold growth in either revenue or spending to growth of factors such as inflation, personal income, population, or some combination of those factors. And the idea with these policies is to limit the long-term growth of government below a certain threshold. So to say, we don't want government spending to grow in proportion to the size of the economy, for example. And when we look around the country at these policies, they vary greatly in their stringency and how much they really affect fiscal decision-making. So there's some states such as Colorado where almost every decision they make in each budget they adopt is driven by their tax and expenditure limit, known as the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. There are other states where either the limit was set so high or it's so easy to override the limit that they have much less of an impact. I think Connecticut is somewhere in between in that the state has means that it can use to adjust the limit. So it isn't the most stringent in the country, but it does have a real effect on fiscal decision-making. So next, limits on appropriations. So the revenue cap is an example of that. As we heard earlier, it limits appropriations to 98.75% of the revenue estimate. And there are only 9 states that have this policy, and they actually have a somewhat different goal, I would say, than tax and expenditure limits. The idea here is that mid-year deficits, are more of a problem than mid-year surpluses. So if you're going to err in one direction, generally states would rather have a mid-year surplus and then say, next year we'll spend that money, than have a mid-year deficit where it's difficult to cut your budget in the middle of the year. You're often sort of scrambling to do that. And so the idea is to create this buffer where even if the revenue estimate is a little bit too high, even if your spending projection is a little bit too low, you won't be dealing with those mid-year budget gaps. So then the volatility cap is an example of what we call a volatility-based rainy day fund deposit rule. And these are policies that require deposits of one-time revenue or a volatile portion of ongoing revenue into the rainy day fund. There are 20 states that have these policies, and they serve 2 different goals, each of which I think is very important to understanding these policies. One is that they're designed to prepare the state for bad budget years. So you take the spikes in revenue in a good year, save it. Then when you have a recession, revenue declines. You can limit the cuts to services. You can limit the tax increases that are necessary by paying down those reserves. The second purpose is to prevent unsustainable growth in revenue booms. So, if you spend every dollar of a revenue increase, then even if you didn't have a recession the next year, if things just sort of normalized, you would have to either cut spending, you'd have to potentially, hire workers and then lay them off. You'd have to promise people services and then take them away. And so the idea is to avoid those kind of disruptions and put government on a more sustainable path. And Pew recommends that states use volatility-based rainy day fund deposit rules. And the reason for that is because they require or encourage deposits and withdrawals at the appropriate point in the economic cycle compared to some of the alternative approaches that states use. And so, for example, let's say you had a year where revenue was projected to decline by 5%. Instead, it only declines by 3%. That would be the type of year typically still where you would be making rainy day fund withdrawals, ideally. But under some of these rules, such as a year-end surplus requirement or a revenue forecast error requirement, you would say, oh, well, revenue came in above forecast. It only declined by 3%. Therefore, we have to make a rainy day fund deposit. So a volatility-based rule is designed to avoid those kinds of situations. Just to drive home this point about volatility a little bit more, Connecticut has somewhat higher volatility than either the 50-state median or most of the states in the Northeast, every state, in fact, except New York. And so with more volatile revenue, it's especially important to be saving that volatile revenue for the years when it declines. And this is driven in Connecticut and several of these other states largely by capital gains and income taxes on capital gains, which tends to be a volatile source. So next, debt limits. Most states have some form of debt limit. 43 states have a debt limit. They limit either authorized debt, as in Connecticut's case, or debt service payments. And so really the idea of these policies is to prevent debt service from growing too high and crowding out other priorities. So if you just sort of kept issuing more and more debt, debt service payments would grow and you'd have less money around for other services. That would also potentially have implications for credit ratings. So that's an overview of the guardrails. Now I'm going to talk about sort of the results of the policies to date. So here what you see is cumulative contributions to both the Budget Reserve Fund and to the pension systems because of the volatility cap and surpluses. And what you see is in the initial years of the guardrails, all of the money is going into the Budget Reserve Fund. And that's because the Budget Reserve Fund is below its cap. But then when the Budget Reserve Fund reaches its cap, money just stops going into the reserve fund and it starts going into the pension systems. So you see in 2021, 22, 23, et cetera, this surge in money going to the pension system to the point by the end of the period, about $8.6 billion has gone into the pension systems. Approximately 3.9 has gone into the Budget Reserve Fund. And this has dramatically changed the savings picture in Connecticut. So this is sort of a history of Connecticut's rainy day fund balance. And you see that the state emptied the Budget Reserve Fund in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Then as of fiscal year 2017, when the guardrails were created, the Budget Reserve Fund was only a little bit more than 1% of annual appropriations. And that's a level that credit rating agencies or other neutral observers would say is far too low to be prepared for a recession or other event. But then you see this surge where the state exceeds the 50-state median. It exceeds this 50-state median, even though, as you can see, the 50-state median itself is growing rapidly. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Connecticut has a more volatile tax code than the median state. So it makes sense that the Budget Reserve Fund would have a higher balance than the median state because the more volatile your tax code, the more you need in reserves. So this is a look at the effect on pensions contributions. And this is a benchmark that measures how much the state would need to contribute to maintain a consistent funding ratio. And so you can see in most years, historically, the state is contributing about what it needs to sort of tread water on the funded ratio. But then in 21 and 22, as you saw earlier, that's when the budget reserve fund is full. And so Connecticut starts to greatly exceed its benchmark. This data only goes through 2022, but if you looked beyond that, you'd see a similar picture. And just to say a little bit more about pensions and the effects on the system, Connecticut's pension plans remain worse funded than most other states. That data is from 2022, but the state continues to trail other states. However, Connecticut is actually contributing more by certain measures to its pension system annually than any other state. So as a share of payroll or as a share of that contribution benchmark, Connecticut's in 2022 were the largest of any state. And just to explain a little bit more what that means, if I made that same graph from the previous slide for every state, Connecticut would be the one that would be highest above the line. And this, as you've heard, is allowing the state to pay down pension debt ahead of schedule and result in more than $700 million in annual savings. Now, the trade-off in setting aside more money for the budget reserve fund and pensions is that it means less money is available for current services. So the amount the state has set aside is equivalent to approximately 9% on average of annual net general fund appropriations over the period. So just in considering these results, there are at least three questions that you should consider as you weigh any changes to the guardrails. One is, and I'll say the first two are ones that I and then Mark are going to talk about for sort of the rest of the presentation. The third is something that's more a matter of your own priorities, something that data and analysis can help inform, but it's fundamentally about what your preferences are. So first, has the state saved enough to be ready for recessions and other short-term challenges? And so as I said, in 2017, it was very obvious the answer to that was no. Now the answer is less obvious, and that's where analysis can help you. And second, to what extent is the state treating some ongoing revenue as one-time or volatile? And so there was a sort of catch-up that the state needed to do because it was behind on pension payments, behind on a budget reserve fund balance. So if you're taking some ongoing revenue and treating it as one-time or volatile, that was the way you were sort of catching up on those things. But over time, as you have caught up to a degree, that's where this question really comes to the forefront. And then the final question is just how you weigh trade-offs between current services and long-term fiscal health. How much do you feel like you need to spend more on current services, that there are demands that are important to you, versus how much you want to continue to pay down these long-term liabilities? So third, determining if Connecticut is saving enough. And Pew recommends that states use an analytical tool called a budget stress test to set savings targets. And let me say a little bit about what stress tests are. They estimate the size of budget shortfalls that would result from recession scenarios and then assess whether the state is prepared for those scenarios. So a typical stress test might say, in a mild recession and in a severe recession, how large would our budget shortfall be? How far would revenue fall? And are we ready for that scenario? And rainy day funds play a fundamental role in assessing whether you're prepared or not. 16 states have conducted stress tests since 2018, and states are using those stress tests to make policy decisions. So you have states like Montana, where the stress test found they had not saved enough, and they raised the cap on the rainy day fund by 250%. You also have states like New Mexico, where the stress test said, actually, we have saved enough. And so this year in New Mexico, they're lowering their savings target, freeing up money to use for other purposes. So Connecticut has a history of stress testing. The state has published stress tests in 2018 and 2019. OFA authored those stress tests in the fiscal accountability reports, but has not since then. OPM, on the other hand, had a new analysis in their November 2024 fiscal accountability report. And this analysis is sort of playing into judgments that the governor's office and OPM are making about sort of what the state can afford. So in the governor's budget proposal, they said that the state was prepared for a moderate recession scenario because of the $4.1 billion budget reserve balance. At the same time, the state has no requirement for regular stress testing, and regular stress tests are valuable because savings targets change over time. Likely recession scenarios change over time. your tax code and the volatility of your tax code also change over time. So I just want to show a little bit more about this OPM analysis, so you can see sort of the math behind it to some degree. So OPM used one of the common approaches for a stress test by looking back at historic recessions and saying, if an event of the same magnitude of that recession happened again, how far would our revenue collections fall? And in both of these two scenarios, one of which was based on the dot-com bust from the early 2000s, the other was based on the Great Recession, there would be no contributions above the volatility cap. So there wouldn't be that extra money going to the BRF or pensions. And then below that, there would be a revenue loss of $3 billion in the scenario similar to that dot-com bust and $5.1 billion in the Great Recession. Now, to contextualize these, this BRF balance is $4.1 billion. So more than the dot-com bust scenario, less than the Great Recession scenario. In weighing a savings target, you'd want to think about that BRF balance. At the same time, it's important to note that when you come into a recession, nobody tells you this is a mild recession or this is a severe recession. You sort of have to, play it as you go. And so states often don't use their entire BRF balance or rainy day fund balance. They often use other tools as well. So I think you could build up this analysis to think about what are other tools we would use to balance our budget. You could also build off it to say, in addition to the revenue loss, what are the increased spending demands in a recession? So if Medicaid enrollment is going to go up, how much will that cost us? So just to sort of lay out some options for next steps, you could use the OPM analysis or a similar analysis to set a savings target. And then that analysis might say, a rainy day fund cap needs to go up. It needs to be higher than 18%, or it might say you have the opportunity to lower it below 18%. You could adjust the volatility cap to make sure you're reaching that target and make sure that you can balance the budget in the event of a recession. And then finally, as I mentioned, you want to plan for regular stress testing, and you also want to incorporate those recessionary spending pressures into your savings target. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mark to discuss the volatility cap.
There we go. Okay, I think, am I on? You can hear me. Okay, good. Okay, my name is Mark Robin from the Pew Charitable Trust, and I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about the volatility cap formula. So as we've already heard, the volatility cap applies to two volatile revenue streams. It's the estimated and final payments of personal income tax and the pass-through entity tax. Revenue from those two volatile streams that exceeds a certain threshold is set aside first to the BRF, up to its cap, and then to pensions and debt. That threshold is really set with two main levers, and that's where I want to spend a lot of time today. The first lever is the initial value that was set in 2018, and that was set equal to 2017 revenue. And then the second lever is the annual adjustment factor, which grows the threshold by the 5-year average growth rate of personal income. So here on the screen, you can see those volatile revenue streams just for some context from 2004 to the present, and then the consensus revenue estimate through 2028. And the dotted gray line is the history of what the current threshold policy has resulted in. So through 2024, the volatility cap has resulted in about $10 billion being set aside. That was about 29% of all the revenue, 29% of this total revenue stream, and also equivalent to about 7% of annual general fund appropriations over that period. And I just finally, before we leave the slide, just point out 2017 here, which appears to be a bit of a low year relative to the handful of years before it, and certainly relative to the years after it. And that will be relevant in a moment when we talk about that a little bit more. So before we do, though, let's talk about, what are some of the priorities that the state might have, and how could an ideal volatility cap sort of help achieve those goals? So one goal might be to have sufficient resources overall for the current budget. And the way a volatility cap can help with that is to to ensure you're funding recurring spending with sort of the reliable recurring portion of these revenue streams. Another goal might be to avoid exposing the current budget to the volatile portion of this revenue. And so, of course, the volatility cap ideally does that by identifying those temporary revenue surges and ensuring you don't spend them on ongoing needs. And similarly, it also provides some cushion. So with the volatility cap below revenue somewhere, it provides some cushion in case revenue were to decline dramatically to hopefully or potentially avoid exposing your budget to that volatility. And then finally, building and maintaining reserves and paying down other liabilities, as we've been discussing here, obviously is one of the goals. And the volatility cap does that by hopefully finding those revenue spikes and dedicating to those purposes. Now, I should note that there can be trade-offs between these different goals, right? So, like all else equal, for instance, a higher threshold that tracks revenue a little more closely would allow you to spend more in the current budget, but also make it more likely potentially that revenue will fall below that threshold in a given year and expose your budget to some of that volatility. Okay, so zooming in here on revenue starting in 2017, just to reiterate, the current formula takes that 2017 value, sort of copy and paste to 2018, and then grows it by that 5-year average growth rate. And those are really the two levers we're going to talk about. So I want to talk about 4 methods of modifying the volatility cap, and these are largely based on some existing or similar to some existing proposals in the state. So the first method is to adjust that starting level, that 2018 level, by adjusting that starting point. The next approach will be to adjust the growth rate of the threshold by changing the annual adjustment factor. And then the third option will be to kind of combine those two approaches, layer them on top of each other. And those first 3 approaches then are working within the existing levers of the policy. And then number 4, the rolling average will be working within a different sort of alternative structure. And for all 4 of these, we'll sort of look at briefly how each of them would have played out if it had been implemented in 2018. And I should also note that we're just talking about the mechanics here of these policies. We're not, of course, talking about things covered like by the treasurer, about the bond lock and the statutory requirements to actually make these changes. Okay, so the first option here is that changing that starting point. As we've noted, the 2017 revenue was used as the starting point initially, so that was $3.15 billion. Another option would be to average revenue up to that point in time. So as I noted, 2017 was a bit of a low year. And so if the goal was to reflect sort of what typical revenue would have been circa 2018, doing something like an average might reflect that better. This is in fact what the governor's budget proposal does, and that increases the would have increased the threshold in 2018 and then had the effect of increasing the threshold in all subsequent years by a proportional amount. The second lever is that annual growth rate. So currently using the 5-year personal income growth rate. One side effect of using a 5-year average is that it mutes some of the year-to-year fluctuations in personal income. This can have effects like around 2022 and 2023, where where personal income was growing unusually quickly. So an alternative could be to use something like a 1-year growth rate of personal income instead of averaging. Use sort of the 1-year growth rate, and in the case of like 2022 and 2023, that would have helped the threshold, grow a little bit faster and keep pace with what revenue was doing. Now, again, there can be trade-offs. It's also true that there can be years where personal income grows slow and maybe even more slowly than typical or average. And so it might grow, this purple line that we've got on the screen here might grow a little bit slower than sort of the typical than the current law threshold. So there are trade-offs there, but my main point in illustrating this is just that this growth rate of the formula is one of the levers that you have to work on. And I should also note that there is a bill existing, HB 5151, that includes as part of its change using a 1-year growth rate, although it also uses the greater of personal income or CPI. So this is not exactly the same, but it's sort of in that vein. Okay, and then briefly, you can those 2 options we've talked about, you can increase the growth rate and you can layer on top of that you can increase the starting point and then layer on top of that an increase in the growth rate. And that would be the green line here. And you can see that's getting approaching more closely to where revenue currently is. I'm going to skip a slide here and then I'll go back to that. So some observations on the current framework. So I'll just point out that working within the two levers that we've got right now, the initial 2018 value really had a significant and permanent effect on the amount of the volatile revenue streams that is saved versus spent in all subsequent years. So that really plays a big role in the formula. And it's also true that the annual adjustment factor may not really reflect how revenue actually grows in the state in the long term. It relies on that assumption that revenue will grow at the rate of personal income growth on average. But if that turns out not to be the case, the difference can accumulate over time, and you can have this sort of growing gap between where the threshold is and where revenue typically is in a given year. And indeed, that seems to be what we've seen since 2018. So now I'll go back one slide if you're following along. So an alternative structure would be to use something like a rolling average of inflation adjusted revenue. So each year it looks back 10 years, it inflation adjusts the data, and then averages it, and then the next year it does the same thing. There's this rolling average window. This is similar to HB 6752, and also was an idea similar to an idea that was floated by the Yale Tobin Center and Connecticut Voices for Children. So a couple observations on that rolling average. Oops. So one way to think about this is that now in the rolling average, we're letting the threshold be determined by the long-term path of revenue itself, rather than using like a secondary measure like personal income. And this helps it have kind of this self-correcting nature where it automatically responds to shifts in the long-term trend of revenue that aren't really captured very well by the current formula. And for those reasons, it may be more effective at really capturing and identifying sort of those transitory portions of revenue and versus the sustainable portion of revenue. On the other hand, like, as a recurring theme here, there are trade-offs. One trade-off might be that using an average, a rolling average, can result some years in the threshold declining, and that would expose your budget to some of that volatility. And now it is the case that using an average sort of by definition is going to tend to average out those ups and downs. But if there were a particularly large decline, that could cause the threshold, a moving average, to decline. And similarly, sort of at least in its most basic form, this moving average tends to track revenue a little more closely, tends to be closer to where revenue is in any given year. And so there's a little bit less cushion. Again, if revenue declines, it could dip below that threshold. And then again, you'd be exposing your budget to some of that volatility. So in summary, I just want to, sort of pull back a step and just reiterate that, the current formula has resulted in the volatility cap being consistently below where actual revenue has tended to be. This has helped you fill your budget reserve fund relatively quickly and make large pension transfers. It's also insulated your budget effectively from these volatile revenue streams. But at the same time, it's likely that you've been setting aside some revenue that probably can be considered reliable revenue. And as my colleague Josh pointed out, doing that for a period of time may have been part of the goal. I don't know. It certainly helped you build your reserve fund quickly. But moving forward, if the goal is to really focus in and set aside only the temporary revenue surges, it seems like the threshold is potentially not doing that. And I'll also note that under all the modifications that we've discussed here today, the budget reserve fund would have been fully filled by the end of fiscal 2022 at the latest, meaning that the higher volatility cap is largely going to come out of pension, the contribution to pensions rather than the budget reserve fund. And I would say looking forward, barring any major withdrawals from the budget reserve fund, the situation is similar. The changing the threshold will largely affect pension transfers rather than sort of the budget reserve fund balance. Again, that's assuming no large withdrawals from the budget reserve fund. And I'll just finish by pointing out that some additional analysis would be helpful here for you all to do in terms of what the sort of historical growth rate and volatility of these revenue streams have been, and what we can expect moving forward. And that will help you make a decision between sort of working within the existing two levers that I've talked about versus moving to something like a moving average. And I would also note that all of these, again, all the options I've been discussing are sort of illustrative examples. They could all be tweaked with different, different growth rates or, averaging in a slightly different way. So these should be interpreted as like, conceptual things that you could consider using to reform the or to change the volatility cap. So with that, I think we will stop and think we'll be doing questions for everyone. Is that
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I thank you for your work both in the past and in helping us create the system in the first place, and also your work informing us today as we look ahead. I had one quick question, and then I will again engage in meaningful eye contact with my colleagues. About the stress testing that was done in 2018 and 2019, and this is perhaps a question for OFA. What that looked like then, and perhaps I should know the answer to that question. Why did we do it then and haven't done it since?
I don't think it's a matter of we haven't done it since. We put that into our fiscal accountability. I think coming out of the whole 2017 experience, for lack of a better word, we thought that was relevant for the fiscal accountability report. It wasn't required at the time, but that is something internally we continually look at. We just haven't published anything like that since then.
Thank you. And I know we in the finance committee have had conversations with you about basically about stress testing and about what a recession might look like. And one of those conversations had to do with not just the direct hit to revenue, but also the sort of shadow effect, which is to say the sort of rebasing, even when growth returns, you're growing off a lower base. And is that part of when we look at, that very simple chart about where we are relative to, the dot-com versus the Great Recession, is that taken into consideration, that sort of not only the direct hit to revenues, but also the sort of going forward, the lower base growth?
Yeah, so the OPM analysis.
Could you turn your microphone on? Sorry. We can hear you, but
Okay.
people online can't hear
Yeah.
you unless you put that.
So the OPM analysis was just looking at the next 2 years. And so it wasn't, stress tests vary in sort of how far out they look. Our recommendation is states should look for as long as there's an effect on revenue, which depending on the magnitude of the recession, could be 2 years or it could be longer than 2 years. So it's certainly a consideration of not only like how long does the sort of acute revenue decline last, but also is there sort of a permanent change in revenue which can occur from a recession and that trajectory.
And I would say there's OPMs, what they presented was, as Josh said, was specific to the upcoming budget. There's a lot of factors beyond that. I mean, your first revenue loss isn't from the rainy day fund, it's reducing that volatility deposit. So you have a cushion above the rainy day fund before you ever get to it. There's other factors that come into play. In most recessions, we get additional federal help. We would have to make assumptions on that. So it's not a one slide picture discussion.
No, none of this is. Thank you. Okay. Senator Funfair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your presentations. I listened to the conversation, particularly from Pew, on the analysis, the observations of our approach, the current approach. And for me, it's really about a philosophy that I haven't heard much in the presentations. And that is, why did we do this? And sometimes age and experience informs us. And in my case, seeing year after year, good years, bad years, good year, bad years. And as someone mentioned earlier, spending as if we were going to have good years year after year. Doesn't happen. It's not happening now. Won't happen going forward. And Madam Chair mentioned about a stress test. We have not had a stress test of this experiment. We have not. But we will. The day is coming. We don't know the hour, but the day is coming. And some of the people in this room, as I look around it, who spend much of their days worrying about these issues will be glad that we have $4 billion, and we hope that that's sufficient. It will go fast, faster than what we can imagine. And when it's gone, the knife comes out. And it's usually on the people who need it the most. When we're in recession and people are unemployed and services are being cut, it's when government traditionally is least able to step in. It's when we're broke. And for the first time, we're saying, well, as long as we recognize that that budget reserve fund is there for a purpose, it's to be spent, not to be held up as a trophy, but to be spent when the hour of need is upon us. I'm not confident, frankly, that we'll do that because we cherish this budget reserve fund. We celebrate it. It's only there to protect those who are most vulnerable in our society and to hopefully sustain ourselves until the economy comes back again. And Connecticut's economy, as I've learned from my friends at OFA, generally rebounds pretty quickly after a recession. But it's during that period that we really are and have been, and I've experienced where we funded a program and cut it 4 months later because the bottom fell out. Specifically, we talk about the 9% that we're not putting towards services because of the constraints. But not much has been said. My colleague, Representative Paletov, talks about the 700 million that has been put back into the budget. Sadly, the governor and we did not earmark those savings towards particular programs that people in this building want. We didn't have a debate. It just was in the budget, washed into the budget without any recognition of that money. And it was not $700 million all at once. It was a growing number, 100 million, 200 million, but it's every year. But there's another 700, 800 million that has been created because of this, because of the threshold going from 3.15, which by the way, was not just an arbitrary number. It was based on where we were at the bottom of the recession in terms of estimates and finals. It was intentional. And that's what I meant about a minute ago about philosophy. It was intentional that we not be back into the place where we're spending volatile revenue in our everyday and every year budgeting process. So that's $1.5 billion. That's averaging $200 million a year. I think most people would say, if you're going to give me 200 million additional, it's not one time, it's additional $200 million or less. I recognize that there have been extraordinary circumstances. OFA as talks about this, federal government during COVID, sending a lot of money to the state of Connecticut, the repatriation of offshore tax revenue. And I think there are other things which I'm forgetting right now that resulted in probably not likely to be seen again at that level over the last several years. But nonetheless, it's $1.5 billion which is, based on my math, about 5.7% of a $26 billion budget versus the 9%. That's not a bad return while we continue to pay down debt. Yes, we may have some of the most aggressive policies, but we also have the most, other than maybe Illinois, the most debt. In New Jersey, we're right there with them. That's not a distinction worth talking about, but it's reality. And so, but by staying the course, we are opening up more opportunities. What we haven't been doing is targeting those expenditures into programs that folks need. I'll end it there, Madam Chair, but I would hope that there's recognition of the fact that there is a benefit being created. It's not like we're just status quo, that significant amount of revenue continues to be made available under the current approach. And I suggest that we look at how to segregate that revenue going forward towards policies that folks believe will advance the quality of life of our state, as opposed to just every year, including this year in this budget. We will do that unless we separate it out. I'll leave it at that, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Ranking Member Senator Fazio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to everyone for their presentations. I have two questions. First, I'd like to ask OFA. I think among many, two of the numbers that are representative of how these budget guardrails have borne fruit to taxpayers and to the state of Connecticut are, as Representative Paletta and Senator Fonfara referenced, the fact that we have paid down about $8 billion of pension liabilities, and that has freed up roughly $700 million per year, or in the coming year, of space to either reduce taxes or spend on other vital services. Without those budgetary guardrails, that reality would have been worse. According to your projections, I assume that if we keep the budget guardrails and those policies in place as they are, that $700 million of budgetary space, again, either to potentially reduce taxes in the future or spend on other vital services, I assume that number will grow under your projections. Is that correct?
The impact of additional deposits would be positive, as both Bill and I have said before. There's other factors that go into determining an ADEC that could change it, but additional deposits themselves would have a positive effect.
Thank you, sir. So, my anticipation as well is that if we were to alter these policies, not only would we be able to pay down less of our billions in unfunded liabilities, but also that we would see less budget space into the future, repeating, to make vital investments or cut taxes on people in Connecticut, which I think is vital, a vital goal to have as a state. And that's because of the fact that these liabilities compound over time. If you make a deposit in the near term, it means it's going to have compounding effects on the liabilities that taxpayers face. Compounding growth exponents are one of the most powerful laws of the universe. My question for Pew, and I appreciate your presentation as well, is the background context. You had a very, very, I think, important bullet point on one of your slides, but the context of these budget policies, which were only put into place really in 2017, is the fiscal burdens that Connecticut taxpayers are facing. You mentioned that we have the 47th funded pension ratio, meaning the fourth worst funding pension ratio of any state. Could you just contextualize the unfunded pension liabilities that the state has compared to other states, the debt burden, the bonded debt burden that Connecticut has compared to other states? That's something I don't think we reference. And also the combined state and local tax burden Connecticut has compared to other states, as far as you know the literature to say.
Certainly. So one thing about pension funding is things change very slowly. That these are obviously multi-decade commitments. And so Connecticut has long had one of the worst funded pension systems in the country. The state has adopted a lot of policies, including in the guardrails, to improve funding, to make sure you're making your annual contributions. And those policies ultimately, will and are improving the situation, but it just takes time, and time in pension systems is often measured by decades, not in years. I think generally, if you combine other long-term liabilities, including debt, along with pensions, Connecticut once again does have some of the highest debt burdens in the country. I don't have offhand tax burden data, but it's something we could get to you after the hearing.
Thank you, sir. I think that was a useful quote that time in pension funding is measured often in decades and not years. And we're less than a decade into these policies, which are starting to bear fruit. So we'd be wise to, I think, adhere to that observation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fozzie. Just as a point of clarity, my understanding is that because Connecticut does not have county government, that is a little bit different for us. And usually when you correct for that, it pulls us up off, it does not vault us up into the top ranks, but it pulls us off the bottom. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that offhand. It is important. Often, like, what are the services provided at the local level versus the state level has a big influence on when you measure, you know, how much do governments spend? What is the tax burden? Those are things that absolutely you need to take into account. So, yes.
Thank you. Representative Paletta.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second time. I do have a brief question surrounding the spending cap, and it may be for OFA or maybe for the folks at Pew. Just as a way of background, we've been talking a lot about money that's been freed up as a result of good fiscal policy, policy that I think dating back from 2017 has led to, you know, spending in the budget for mostly good reasons. Maybe, you know, that's up for debate. But the spending cap, and I thought it was mentioned, I think you folks mentioned that when we adjust the base of the spending cap, that also frees up more spending, correct? Has there been more spending that has been freed up as a result of the base being adjusted of the spending cap?
I'll let Chris give you the details on that. The base adjustment he was talking about is to make it apples to apples. So an example, the governor proposed moving in his budget an appropriations for town aid roads, $60 million to the bonding. When that happens, we have to do a base adjustment to make it so you don't get a cap advantage for that. The base adjustment is to negate any cap.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. And I would say actually, it can have either effect. It can create more room or it can take away allowable, I shouldn't say room, allowable growth is how I talk about it. So in the governor's budget, as Neil mentioned, there's some items that are taken out of, I think the town aid road was moved to bonding. And I think there's about $10 million from the cannabis social equity fund that was moved off budget. Because those are being taken out of the base, the growth rate is not applied to those items. That's about, I think they total about $70 million in FY26. So that's sort of foregone allowable growth. Now, in FY27, we're moving the unfunded actuarial liability of the teachers' retirement system on budget, right? And so you're moving 1.4 billion on budget and you're applying the growth rate to that. That actually gives you about $77 million worth of allowable growth. So the intention is to make it apples to apples and keep it even so as to not, quote unquote, game the cap. But when you do move items on and off budget, it can either help or hurt you, depending on your perspective, in terms of allowable spending.
But to clarify, not by the amount that's moving on or off budget, the growth applied to that amount moving or off.
Thank you for that. So in your analysis, have we been able to spend more money as a result of that? Has there been more, have we spent more as a result of adjusting that, or?
Like as Chris said, they go both ways. So the adjustments of things have come on, things have come off. I don't know if we have an answer for that.
Okay.
Straight up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Piscopo, followed by Representative Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I think early on in your presentation, you had the fiscal analysis presentation. You had a statutory protections, if you will, on each of the caps, and you had a that if there was a proposed change for the volatility cap, it would take 2/3 vote of the legislature to change that. This year, the budget we're contemplating has a $300 million expenditure right off the back of the volatility cap. So my question goes to that. it's for a good reason. It's for a good purpose, good policy, but it will always be for a good policy, but the fact is that we're taking 300 million off the back end of the volatility cap before it's even calculated into the volatility cap. That would take a 2/3 vote of the legislature, according to your presentation. Am I correct in that?
I like to lead all these answers by saying I'm not a lawyer, but I believe the governor had said even in his presentation. I think the governor had said that that is what was contemplated. The 3/5.
Thank you.
Just to jump in briefly, so it would be what's required under the statutes is a 3/5 vote of the legislature. That money would increase the threshold for the volatility cap. So essentially, that additional revenue would flow directly into the general fund, and depending on where we ended the year, could end in that additional surplus being there at the end of the year, but then would be transferred.
Thank you. And while I have you up, is it part of your analysis if we take 300 million that was supposed to go into the volatility cap, if we take that away from the volatility cap, my question goes into the 700 million. That's the 700 million is part of the the revenue we get on the spending side because we're paying down principal and interest. Do you have a calculation of the 300 million coming off the volatility cap, what loss that would be to our budget?
It would not be a loss in comparison to the 700 million because that is the result of deposits that were already made. It would, should we continue to have positive results with our volatility cap, it would lower those deposits in the future. So it would, presumably, if we keep making volatility deposits and paying down additional long-term liability, that savings in the ADEC line would continue to grow by diverting part of that outside, basically lowering those volatility deposits. The growth in that additional savings would be lower.
And be low. I'm violating the two questions. Being lower would, you would have that figure how much lower it would be. In other words, we're not going to be able to put 300 more million into our retirement fund payoff. So that much less, how much lower would that be in principal and interest?
I'm getting told about $24 million on an annual basis from the lowering by 300 million.
Thank you, Representative Fiscal. I allowed you an extra question because of your affirmative statement that however we spend the money is always for a good purpose. Glad to hear that. Representative Farrar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now that I know the gateway to getting the third question, I'll stick with it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being with us today. It's a great opportunity for us to dig deeper as a committee and hopefully as a legislature into what is working and not working about the policies that we've pursued as a state. And I do appreciate the Senate Chair's comments on why these were created, especially for those of us that weren't here when that happened. And I also think it's relevant, as to why we're having this conversation, because so many of us have seen in our districts and in our state just how much need there really is, increased need coming out of COVID, with just so many of our families and workers and seniors struggling. And that gets at my first question, which is that I think, kind of all the research I've looked at, over the years is that public investment leads to economic growth, and public investment can often be a key to also reducing inequality, which hinders economic growth. And I feel like this question might be for Pew, but I'm curious, when you all are looking at the metrics of how these guardrails have worked in Connecticut or other states, do you look closely at how this has impacted the economic growth, for instance, of our state and other states as well?
Sure. So I think for one thing, it's difficult to measure that, but certainly one thing we always emphasize in our research is that there are certain opportunities you have to spend money in a way that creates good results over the long term and can save you money over the long term. And so if you have, you know, needs that aren't addressed, then sometimes it costs more to address them after the fact. And so that's where, and those three questions I laid out, the third question is really this issue of priorities of, like, we've heard like having $700 million more because of better pension payments is a huge benefit to the state. At the same time, there are these needs for current services, and how you weigh those things and what is better for the state in the long term is, I think, one of the most difficult questions in this whole discussion, but it's an important one to be considering.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't see any other answers to that, so I'll move on to my second question, which gets at a little bit more in depth about the volatility cap. And I do think this is directed at Pew, but if others have thoughts on it, I welcome it. Because it is a focus on capturing volatile revenue, one of the things I know it's not currently in the way that we statutorily define our volatility cap, and I haven't heard to be a part of discussions, is should the volatility cap be adjusted automatically if the underlying tax revenues are increased in any way? And again, I'm curious if that's something that has come forward in other states around their policies to ensure that that is automatically a part of the policy.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think if I understand the question, I think the part of the answer would be the fourth option that I kind of discussed, which is that rolling average of inflation adjusted revenue. I think it would kind of naturally, that's sort of the point. It's averaging revenue over a period of time. And so if revenue were to grow particularly quickly or grow particularly slowly, I mean, it's possible that revenue could, these volatile sources could kind of level out for a period of time. I mean, you know, Pew does not have a, you know, we can't predict the future, and everyone does the best they can when doing revenue estimates and everything, but especially for these types of revenue sources, that could be hard to predict. So the advantage of that moving average is it just, you're looking at revenue and you're letting it tell you on average kind of where it's going. It's, you know, it will never be perfect. There could be years where it continues to increase, but revenue decreases because of how all the averaging works out, right? But over the long term, it should track where revenue is going. So I think that's, if I understand, I think that's part of the answer to your question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that example could potentially resolve those increases or decreases over time based on certain tax policies. So that's very helpful. I appreciate it. And thank you, the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Shannon, followed by Representative Elliott online.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you guys for the presentation. This is such really great information, especially as a new person. So I'm trying to understand how the caps kind of interact with each other. So if we're talking about changing the volatility cap or how would that mess with like the revenue or the other caps? Sorry.
I won. A change in the volatility cap, it would depend on how it is, but basically, I'll use the governor's proposal. He essentially, his adjustment would mean that there's $300 million in additional revenue available for the regular budget to balance the regular budget. The volatility basically, and this is what Bill had said earlier, it takes revenue off the table for budgeting balancing purposes. So in changing that, it makes more available. You still have the spending cap to deal with and other things, but it makes more available to balance budgets essentially.
Thank you. Representative Elliott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is very similar to Representative Farrar's question, but I don't think it's the exact same thing. So when we're talking about the downside of putting the money to pensions and the budget reserve fund, we're talking about limiting how much we spend on services. But are there also economic impacts, like in terms of not growing out the economy and then not having additional revenue from that? Are there studies out there that show how much we're missing by not making those public investments?
Yeah, I think most analysis that I've seen of the guardrails has focused not on sort of the direct effects and not on sort of the dynamic effects. And that's true of most state fiscal analysis, is that but usually when you're analyzing, say, a tax policy change, what you're looking at is, well, if we lower this tax, we'll collect less revenue. If we raise this tax, we'll collect more revenue. There is then, there can be dynamic effects. The dynamic effects very quickly get very complicated, because if you spend less money on one thing, then you spend more on something else. And so you have to do both of those sorts of trade-offs. So I think it's certainly a very important thing to consider. It's not something that we, at least at Pew, have data on.
I guess my point then generally is that we can see $200 million, say, that we have saved in consecutive future years, but we don't know what the delta is in terms of what the missed cost and missed opportunity is from what we would have made had we made these investments. Then the other question I have, my second and final question, is just making sure that I was reading that graph right. So I know we're doing the best we ever have with our budget reserve fund at $4.1 billion, but judging by that over $5 billion cost, were we to have another recession like 08, 09, were you saying that we do not have the reserves to weather a similar storm?
That's correct based on OPM's analysis. We did sort of some of our own math, and just our analysis would be pretty similar to OPM's analysis, sort of back of the envelope. Now, I will say that it isn't necessarily the case that for a recession as severe as the Great Recession, a state would set its target to be ready for that. It would be very reasonable to say a recession of the magnitude of the Great Recession will only happen once every, I don't know how many years, but potentially once every several decades. And we don't need to save enough to be ready for that. In those circumstances, we'd be willing to, do, whether it's revenue increases, spending cuts, other budget maneuvers, rely on other kinds of reserves we have. So it isn't necessarily the case that for the severe recession scenario, states routinely say, we need savings to be completely prepared for that scenario.
Thank you, and I'll reserve my other 20 questions for our chair after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Rader.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you who came here today and so succinctly explained this to all of us, and hopefully a lot of folks watching who can now go back and better understand our guardrails. Folks at the Pew Trust, you earlier said that Connecticut has a higher volatility average than the median average of New England states. Then you went on to explain that we have a more volatile tax code than most. Can you give some examples? When you say that, it just sounds like a big umbrella. And I'm just curious, because I think it would be informative to better understand why we're considered a very volatile state in terms of tax code. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say volatility depends both on a state's tax code and also on its economy. And so how volatile your economy is and affects, whether revenue goes up and down in a recession or in an economic boom, and then also your tax code. So in some states, it's really like there are natural resource states where severance taxes cause volatility. That's not the category Connecticut's in. Instead, states that rely more on capital gains because the stock market goes up and down, because those gains tend to be more volatile. That's where volatility comes from. And so in general, looking across the states, personal income tax is more volatile than sales tax. And so states that are more dependent on personal income tax tend to have more volatility, and in particular, the capital gains portion of volatility tax. I will say part of the idea of the volatility cap was to take personal income taxes and then say, what is the more volatile portion of this relatively volatile tax, and set it aside. So that was sort of the concept, is that's where some of the volatility is in the state, and to kind of mitigate that volatility.
And just to add to that, I would say also, it's tax code, it's your economy, it's also your taxpayers, right? So if you're a state that has, where your taxpayers are earning a lot of capital gains versus another state where that's just not, what the population looks like, then that will also play into it, right? So it's not just that your tax code is causing this, it's the people that you have potentially, or that's a factor to consider.
Yeah, thank you. It's understandable, but I just thought it would be helpful to kind of offer that explanation in terms of the audience watching. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And Senator Fazio for a second time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the indulgence. I also want to thank the Treasurer Russell, for his presentation and being here. My first question is, quickly, have you had any interaction with rating agencies recently about proposals to alter the budget guardrails? And if so, what was their disposition?
Sure. So there've been limited interaction. We've gotten some check-ins or conversations that I've had more informally as I've just been out and seen some of the kind of members of our rating agency teams. Mostly curiosity. I think people are watching closely to just what we're doing. And we've been hesitant about providing too much information until we had some further clarity outside of, I think just stating that the real conversations that we've seen have all been looking at adjustments that would be allowable under the guardrails and the bond covenants themselves.
Okay, so no clear disposition from them on any proposals in the last 2 weeks.
That's correct. And the rating agencies really don't do preliminary kind of,
okay,
this is
fair
what we're
enough.
seeing. If this happens, this may impact you that way. We have our regular meetings with rating agencies, particularly when we're heading into bond issuances, where we go through full presentations with OPM, and that's really where those ratings are ultimately based on.
And you, I can recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I have spoken positively about the effects of these budget controls on your ability to help pay down some of those unfunded pension liabilities to protect both state employees and taxpayers. Do you have significant concerns about making major alterations to them on the ability of you and your office to continue to reduce those liabilities?
So no, and just to be very clear, I was asked to be here in a very objective capacity. So I'm trying to make sure that I don't bring my own kind of views into these conversations. What I would say is, from the proposals that we've seen and based on current projections, allowable, my main piece is making sure we are staying true to our bond covenants and that we are following through with commitments that we've made to bondholders. And I think that proposals that have been put forward within that context, I think are all very reasonable. And I don't think would impact our ability not only to continue making required contributions to our pension fund, but with still projected really significant additional contributions over the next several years.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, for allowing me to test the boundaries of the hearing, and thank you to the chair for the indulgence.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Martin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Eric, I believe the amount that we had contributed to our pensions going back to 2016, 17, 24, 25% perhaps were funded. And since then, we've changed that number to close to 50, I believe, in one fund, and then maybe in the 60s, another fund. So we've done pretty well in the last few years because of these structural changes that we've made with these fiscal guardrails. So my question is, what is the goal? Taking a line from the good chair, why did we do this? And obviously it was to address that unfunded liability as well as the recurring deficits that we are experiencing for decades, right? So my question is, currently, what is the goal? What number do we want to get to? Is it 75? Is it 80? Where we're going to be really content in that, all right, we've achieved this is where we want to be regarding those funds.
Yeah, so I would start just by saying, to your point around our improved funded ratio, our pension fund over the last 10 years has essentially doubled in size. We were at about $30 billion in assets under management back in 2014. We're now at about $60 billion in assets under management. And so it's really significant growth. I think there are a lot of factors, as was mentioned, when we're looking at pension fund funded ratios performance, we're really thinking about these things longer term. And so what has gone into that is certainly making our required contributions, with first and foremost, which we went about 70 years without properly funding our pensions. There've been a lot of concessions on the part of state employees, as you all know, with different tiers that are built into our system now. So additional contributions that are also going in from state employees that have helped to improve that. And then certainly performance, and then these additional contributions that have been paid in as a result of the fiscal guardrails. The kind of goal, obviously, from my perspective, would be to be fully funded. I think these are policy decisions, though, that we, that you as the legislature and as with the administration need to ultimately decide. I think the point of these guardrails and why we are looking at these opportunities when we come out of these bond covenants is so that we can check in as a state to see where we are and if the guardrails are still meeting those policy objectives, or if there are ways that we can strike additional balance between addressing long-term debt and the state's overall fiscal health with current needs that we need to finance as a state right now. And so, you know, a lot of these decisions from the goal of the guardrails is actually something that you as the legislature are really setting, more so than just me in the treasurer's office managing our actual pension assets.
So if we were to hold the line currently, by what year would we get to 100% funded?
Yeah, so we re-amortized our pension fund. So we are set to be fully funded in 2048, I'm sorry. And that, just to be clear, is not, while we are making these additional contributions, we are increasing our funded ratio at a quicker pace, but that end date is the same. Our amortization, so how much we're making in required contributions every year, is with the goal of us being fully funded at that 2048 date. And that will be the fully funded target, no matter how much we put in additional contributions. Where we are getting savings now is that we're improving our funded ratio more quickly, and we're lowering what those required contributions are on an annual basis out of our general fund budget.
And allowing you use those extra funds for our balance in our budget, or using them for services.
It's freeing up those additional funds
Correct.
for,
Okay.
yes, other.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think this question goes to Neil. Neil, you talked about in your slide, you had a base adjustment. And I thought I read a shift from it. If we did a base adjustment, that there would be a shift from on budget to off budget. Could you explain that?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah,
Wait a
we
minute,
did talk about-
I got a coin right here. Hang on.
We did talk about base adjustments, and the intent of a base adjustment it's always been something that has been the practice of OFA and OPM. It became a statutory requirement in 2017. And the reason for that is because it's intended to make sure that you have an apples to apples basis for when you either move things on budget or move things off budget. As I talked about, it can affect how much allowable growth you have in any given year. If you're moving things on budget and then growing on that amount going forward, you'll have higher allowable growth. If you move things off budget and then are not allowed to grow on those items that are being moved off budget, you'll have less allowable growth. But the intention with the base adjustment is to sort of maintain parity from year to year when you're calculating how much your spending cap is relative to the base year.
So in the governor's budget, he spoke of setting up this endowment fund of $300 million. So the way I understand it, that would be off budget.
That would be off budget, yeah, because that's new funding that has not been part of the appropriations base for the spending cap calculation. The governor's proposal would create that off budget, and therefore it would not be subject to the spending cap at all.
Is that because we haven't described it as an expenditure? Similar to what we did in 1991, and we went a few decades without identifying the expenditures. in order for us to sort of maintain our spending growth.
That's, I actually made a reference when I was speaking earlier. Everyone calls it spending cap. It's technically an appropriations cap. It caps the 13 appropriated funds. If this is something set up outside of that, it's not subject to that. cap.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Winter online.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation. A couple questions. One, how do these fiscal controls affect the state's ability to adjust or adapt to potential massive federal cuts? You know, they've more than 800 trillion or $1 billion has been proposed for Medicaid, for example.
I think the quickest answer would be they build in a cushion, be it a federal change, be it a recession we were talking about earlier. Both the revenue that's over and above the volatility cap right now essentially acts as a cushion. The budget reserve fund itself acts as a cushion. How we would deal with anything coming from the federal government would be up to you folks as policymakers.
And I would just note from a spending cap specific perspective, there is an exemption for federal funds that are appropriated from the spending cap. So, you know, whatever level of federal funds we receive going forward, that would have no impact on the cap.
Thank you.
I guess I would
Go
also
ahead.
just note that in addition, from both the statutory and bond covenant perspective, there is the ability in the event that this federal withholding or any additional policy changes that really put the state in a bad place moving forward, that there is this flexibility for the governor to declare a state of emergency or declare emergency or extraordinary circumstances that could allow us to make adjustments to that spending cap if necessary as well.
Thank you. And do you all have recommendations to the committee beyond the stress test about how to evaluate or assess the guardrails on an ongoing basis?
Well, from OFA's point of view, we do not make policy recommendations. We work with you folks to help develop your policies.
I think some of the like different models of the volatility cap show like your different options, these levers you can pull. And I think the key thing would be to do forward-looking analysis on any proposed change. So under a variety of scenarios. So you can see, you know, if we change the cap in this way, let's look at a scenario with, you know, like greater volatility in revenue, or a scenario where you build in that recession, because as the chair said, these haven't been tested under recession. So I think what we'd really recommend is do that forward-looking analysis in addition to the historic analysis, and that can inform, you know, how would we have to make budget cuts under scenarios? How likely are those scenarios? I think that's really where our mind would go, in addition to doing the stress testing to set that savings target.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Fonfara, our closer.
Briefly, thank you, Madam Chair. For Treasurer Russell, thank you very much for your presentation. First, let me set the stage here. I don't know if most people appreciate how much that debt that's been spoken about here in the last few questions is costing us in the budget. It's about, this is rough, $3.3 billion every year in our $25-26 billion budget. $3.3 billion goes to pay off that debt. So when we talk about, you know, adjusting, which is, that's why we're here, to have this conversation and see where it takes us. But that's not considered very often in this dialogue about what debt is costing us, the lost opportunity in terms of investments in Connecticut, investments in the needs of our state that are going unmet. It was $4 billion just a few years ago. A lot of money. Treasurer Russell, can you give us a sense? You've informed us over the last few years, more than the last few years, about the improved credit rating and what that's resulted in terms of our borrowing costs or lost opportunity in that regard. What was it like before compared to what it's now? What has it meant for Connecticut as a state in terms of opportunity?
Certainly, and I'm happy to kind of get some more detailed information to follow up with you on, but our bond rating has improved dramatically. We've had several bond ratings just in the last few years, but we are AA rated. We were just recently upgraded to AA plus by Kroll. We are on a positive outlook from two additional rating agencies, which means that they are looking at whether or not they're going to upgrade us in the very near future. And what this ultimately means is that as we are going out to the market, as folks are purchasing our bonds, we are able to get lower interest rates on that debt that we are issuing. And so when you were thinking about, us issuing billions of dollars of debt on an annual basis, it's really significant savings as we go out to the market to fund capital projects like transportation infrastructure and housing and childcare facilities across our state. And so it certainly has had a huge economic impact. It's hard to quantify exactly because a lot of this is about kind of what rates we're getting versus the rest of the market, but it certainly has been positive, and we've had dramatic improvements in terms of ratings.
And that's due to what?
Our overall fiscal health, for certainly. There's been the fact that, if you think just back to 2019, where we had little to nothing in a reserve fund, that we had really volatile budgets, right? We would end up with huge holes in our budgets year to year. The fact that we've shifted this, and not only, again, the progress that I think we've made in terms of having a rainy day fund and having balanced budgets, but it's the fact that we, as a state, remain committed to this sense of fiscal health moving forward. That certainly has been a huge topic of conversation, and the guardrails are certainly at the center of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator, I know you said the word closer, but always you inspire others. So we have two other quick questions. Representative Wilson.
Very sorry. Thank you. My question kind of really might be OFA might be able to answer, but as we continue to have this conversation around the guardrails, has there been any analysis on how the guardrails would impact inequities around the state? That's pretty much the question.
I don't think that's something we've necessarily provided. I think that might be something in the context of policy discussion in developing a budget going forward, that conversations that you folks would have in developing your budget proposals.
Thank you, Representative. And Representative Constantine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris, in answer to Representative Winter's question, you mentioned something about federal funding changes and how that would be in relation to the spending cap. Could you detail that a little bit more?
Sure. So the state receives obviously federal funds. I believe most of it is not appropriated. The state, a number of years ago, a long time ago, it went to a net appropriating basis for Medicaid, which I think is our #1 federal fund expenditure.
For the Medicaid account, the total spend very roughly is about $6 billion. You only, if you look in the budget, see about $3 billion of it. The federal portion was basically comes in to the agency specifically. And that's an example where a cap adjustment was made, where something had been gross appropriated, it was moved to net, a cap adjustment was made for that.
Right. So most of our federal funds, the point that I'm trying to make, are not appropriated. And the spending cap is essentially an appropriations cap, as Neil pointed out. So what we're sort of left with is, in terms of the spending cap impact, it's any federal funds that the state's either required to be appropriated, there are some of those, or the state piece that is not net funded. Any amount of federal funding associated with those, again, appropriated federal funds, those are exempt from the cap. So whether they're more or less, it really shouldn't have that much of a cap impact. Actually shouldn't have any cap impact. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Just kind of following up on the uncertainty from on the federal side, back to Pew. Josh and Mark, you mentioned 4 methods of modifying the volatility cap, just as examples, about what's being done around the rest of the country. Given the sources of our revenue and our ties to Wall Street, is there one that you recommend, don't recommend, like number 4 with a rolling average, given our volatility? Is there something that we should be staying away from if we are looking at this?
So we don't have specific recommendations on, what the right method is. I think as I tried to lay out, there are some trade-offs with each one. I think the given that it is a pretty volatile revenue stream and is hard to predict, I think the method of using personal income does have that side effect that it might not be totally connected to where revenue goes in the long term. It's not a prediction. It's just we just don't know. You don't know if that's going to be the case. So that would be yeah, I would say that's like one of the big questions to wrestle with here. Yeah.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, and we're just a little slightly over our target of 1 o'clock. I again want to thank all of you for being here and for all the significant work that you did in advance of coming here, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
Quickly, before I adjourn, our next meeting is this afternoon at 2 o'clock. So Finance Committee, we're not going too far away. See you later. Thank you. We're adjourned.